the campus protest that sprang up across America following Israel's response to the October 7th attacks are the canvas for this latest salvo in the White House versus liberal intellect.
Nation can't believe they're on Harvard's side. Yeah, exactly. Nation can't believe it is on Harvard's side. I am the nation. I'm part of the nation. I can't believe I'm saying that this like bastion of neoliberal thought that probably is one of the most significant farming operations for the goddamn intelligence agencies and ambassador program. I am defending it right now because although it is a factory of war criminals, it still does a ton of very valuable research, man.
Or, in President Trump's words,
Hamasavard Madrasa University. Yeah, Hamasvard. The Hamasvard Madrasa.
Radical left bird brains. Let's bring you up to speed. Foreign students can, currently at least, still come to Harvard. Over the last 24 hours, Harvard's international student program was first revoked by the Department of Homeland Security, then challenged, and finally, in the last few hours, reinstated by a judge. Harvard had called the White House clampdown a blatant violation of the law, writing to foreign students in this letter: "You are vital members of our community. We'll support you as we do our utmost to ensure that Harvard remains open to the world." Foreigners are a quarter of Harvard's nearly 30,000 student body. Leo Ackerman is due to be one of them. He has a place to study education management, but knowing he might not be welcome is unsettling, to say the least.
It's a sad and uncertain day, not just for what it means for my life.
Oh no, bro, you don't sound American to me, big dog. You don't sound too American to me, big dog.
I'm exploring other opportunities because, you know, I don't want to be defined. I don't want to have the Trump administration, you know, define or decide my future.
History is
yeah. Hamasvard has a international student body of almost 24%. There's a quarter of the students that go there.
littered with crackdowns by hardline governments on intellectuals. But the escalating disputes between the White House, US universities in general, and Harvard in particular has many deeply concerned. When the Department of Homeland Security Secretary unveiled the ban yesterday, she said, "Let this serve as a warning to all universities and academic institutions across the country."
For the record, I gotta repeat this over and over again, but this is exactly what the Nazis did. Exactly what the Nazis did. The Nazis revoked the citizenship and humanity of Jews, communists, socialists alike. Okay? We are revoking the citizenship of student visa holders in a similar vein. That's it. The only thing that's changed is like the targets and who we have decided to make the enemy. It's all being conducted off of immigration enforcement under the umbrella of immigration enforcement. Most of Noam's body isn't old enough to go to college. Okay, well, yeah, she did get a lot of gender affirming surgery. Only she gets to do that.
Trump administration says Harvard has failed to tackle anti-Semitism. So it wants control of who Harvard hires and has told it to hand over private information on foreign students. Some Jewish students are nervous the clampdown in their name is in fact a power grab.
There is definitely an issue with anti-Semitism on campuses, and that is a problem that deserves a serious solution. But what's happening now is using that situation as an excuse for an entirely different agenda. And that agenda for the Trump administration, and the way I understand it, is to consolidate power within the executive branch. It is to eliminate any institutions or any public institutions that can stand in their way.
Where does this end? In academic terms, funding cuts, reports of professors looking to leave the country, a drop in overseas student applications. But what about democracy and freedom of speech?
Today's development is just another escalation in the Trump administration's vendetta against Harvard. You can govern by persuasion or force. The American tradition chose speech and dissent, not threats and fear. And few things are more un-American than a government that fears criticism or seeks to punish it.
A judge has stayed the government ban on Harvard recruiting foreign students for 2 weeks, when it will hear their challenge in full. The White House tonight dismissed Harvard's case as frivolous.
Well, I'm joined now by Cornell William Brooks, who's a professor at the Harvard Kennedy School at Harvard University. He's a former president of the civil rights group, the NAACP. If Harvard loses this, ultimately, what would it do to the university?
Well, let me just state at the outset that I can't imagine Harvard losing this case given the First Amendment claims. And just to be clear, the First Amendment the protection of speech in this country extends to all citizens and all residents of the country, including international students. So it's hard for me to imagine that. But if Harvard were to lose the case, it has tremendous consequences for not just students at Harvard, but students across the country. Why? What this means is at Harvard, 1 out of every 4 students is an international student. In the School of Government, the John F. Kennedy School of Government, where I teach, 60% of the students are international. In the community colleges.
That's right. That's the next wave of un-American terrorists he's teaching. Okay, time to get him out of here.
In the colleges and universities across the United States, we have students from around the world.
Are you going to add something, or should I just go watch the original? Brother, we're 4 minutes and 29 seconds into this video. Do you know how many minutes I've spent already reacting to this video? Like, it's been at least 10 minutes since we started watching the video. I'm sorry that there was a brief pause here for from minute 2 to minute 4.
The global campus to U.S. borders, you literally change American education for the worse. So the consequences are tremendous in terms of learning. One, the consequences in terms of money, finances, the fiscal stability of American colleges and universities is significant. Why? Because international students quite often come to this country, they pay tuition, pay for housing just like students elsewhere, but they often do so in ways that support American students.
Yeah.
Number 3, and lastly, is this. None of us in the modern world can do research by ourselves in our offices by ourselves. We need to do research, study, and learning in a global community and a global classroom. So were the Trump administration to win, this would be devastating for Harvard and far more devastating for higher education and education more broadly.
Well, Trump, I mean, clearly hates Harvard because he's just said there are people there that can't add 2 and 2. So how did they get into Harvard? Then they're out protesting against the United States being anti-Semitic.
Well, first of all, let's be clear. Where we have an administration that has a postdoc in banning books, I'm not entirely sure they're in the best position to criticize Harvard with respect to educating students. Point 1. Point 2.
I wish more people would just be like, you guys are ridiculous with this anti-Semitism shit, okay? What the Nobody talked about the crisis of anti-Semitism when they were literally bringing neo-Nazis to college campuses. The entire media discourse surrounding that in 2016, I was there, I remember, was actually about how these Nazis must be on campus. And those were actually anti-Semitic. Not anti-Semitic in the way that the government considers saying mean things about the criminal entity of Israel is anti-Semitic. Okay? What are we doing? Actual anti-Semites were running through college campuses, and literally everyone in the media was like, you can't punch a Nazi, you can't hurt the feelings of a Nazi, you have to have Nazis on your college campuses. You must allow Nazis to be on college campuses. Now, Twitter is infested with Nazi sentiment. Kaya, place, what are we doing? What are you looking at? What are you looking at? That's crazy. My mom is just walking around back and forth in the background, so she's like, come on, it's walk time, I think. Anyway, as I was saying, the entire discourse surrounding that was how we have to hug Nazis and kiss Nazis and become Nazis. Please, why don't you guys be nicer to Nazis? And then now that's not even a point of contention at this point. Now they're like, you know who the real Nazis are? Jewish students that say free Palestine, queer English majors that are pissed off at Israel's unlimited baby murder campaign. Man, I think professors and people in positions of power, especially like educated individuals like this guy and many others, need to drop this ridiculous, cynical framing. It's just, I don't get it. I don't know why they just like entertain this song and dance like, oh yeah, dude, you're right. Yeah, it's really, really fucked up what's going on. You know, if you're a pro-Israel student, while Israel is a Nazi country doing a Holocaust, and you want to defend that, you can have your feelings hurt on college campuses, and that's terrifying. We can't have that happen, especially amongst like younger generations where the overwhelming majority is like on that Israel It's over, man. It's over. What are we doing? I mean, I know why. I know why they're doing that. It's because there's a lot of donors still, like Bill Smokes Crackman and many others that are like, how dare you let people say mean words about the Nazi state doing a genocide? I will do everything I can to stop the funding.
As was indicated earlier in this report, the Trump administration is using anti-Semitism to carry out a political agenda.
But there is a problem there, isn't there? I mean, everyone acknowledges that on left and right.
Everyone acknowledges that. And let me be clear, as the former president.
I guess in a way, it is correct. It is consistent. You're right, Chatter. I just realized Israel is a neo-Nazi country. It's a fascist country doing a Holocaust. And neo-Nazis are also fascists. And in both circumstances, the media is technically still preserving the feelings of fascists by being like, neo-Nazis are allowed to roam college campuses. That's free speech. And also, people who want to support Israel have to roam college campuses without any pushback whatsoever. That's also free speech. Yes, anti-fascism is the side that almost always gets bullied and destroyed and is not allowed to speak. The country where Israel is the most popular in Europe is Germany, with a whopping 22% viewing the country favorably. Oh my God. 69% of the Spanish view Israel unfavorably. Europe's Israel policy is so out of sync with the desires of European publics. You know what? I was wrong. Europe, you're sweet, dude. I was so wrong. These numbers are even better than America. Okay? These are February 2025, though. You think these numbers have improved? Chatter. You think these numbers have improved since February, where Israel's getting the most criticism from legacy publishers even now, finally, since those numbers? As I always say, if you think you hate Israel, nope, you don't hate Israel enough. We can get those numbers up, okay? We can get those numbers up, especially considering that since then, Israel has violated a ceasefire, implemented its mass starvation campaign, and 2 months have passed where Israel refused to let any humanitarian aid into the Strip, and babies started dying due to malnutrition, due to a famine that Israel caused. I suspect that these numbers are not swinging in Israel's direction anytime soon, especially considering that the latest poll that came out of Germany showed that there was an 80% unfavorability rate. Didn't we see a poll by Germany that no, the poll we saw by Germany didn't say the opposite. It said this, but worse. The Western liberal democracy's undying loyalty to the fascist nation state of Israel that is currently conducting a genocide is a double death spiral, a double suicide. Fascism is a suicidal ideology anyway, because inevitably you run out of targets and you choose to focus on the interior policing, right? It doesn't even get to that point, though. Usually there's military intervention before that step is implemented. And what's interesting about this is that this is basically showing to the European public that they have no say in the democratic process, that democracy is simply a lie, okay? That democracy in the Western liberal nations that fancy themselves to be the bastion of the defenders of liberal democracy and the international world order, they are realizing, their populations are realizing that it's not happening. It's not real. That's just a falsehood. And Israel is the reason why people are going to start recognizing that this is a simple falsehood. Everyone get more Israel phobic now. Yeah, I saw Israelophobia is out of control. It's the most dangerous bigotry of our time. Yeah, if you're a Nazi, who wrote this? A fascist? Guys, Germanophobia is on the rise, I write, in 1939 from Nazi Germany.
President and CEO of the NAACP, the largest and oldest civil rights organization in the country, and one that was formed by African Americans and Jewish Americans. I take anti-Semitism seriously. So to address anti-Semitism,
is the dynamic with latent anti-Semitism among the public the same in Europe? Worse in Europe, probably. They are like, dude, Europe is the OG historic anti-Semites. There's never been a moment on the planet where Europe was not more there's never been a moment on the planet where Europe has historically been less anti-Semitic than any other place on the planet. Okay? They are the OG. They are the OG anti-Semites. So yes, I'm sure that there is a lot of anti-Semitism in that attitude as well. Europe literally invented anti-Semitism. Marine Le Pen literally campaigned on not letting Jews wear yarmulkes in public. What are we talking about here? That is so... God, French people are on a different level, dude. French people are so crazy. French people operate on like a antiquated version of anti-Semitism. Like... Which, ironically, also very pro-Israel. Like, at least the administrations are. The government is. The Anti-Jewish League of France was founded in 1889 by journalist Edouard Drumont with the support of the other right-wing French anti-Semites, such as Jacques Deby, Albert Milot, and Marquis de Moret. First known under the name of Ligue Nationale Antisémite de France, or Ligue Antisémite Française. The Nationalist League was particularly active during the Dreyfus Affair. Besides spreading anti-Semitic propaganda, the League was also anti-Masonry. And, hey, guys, look at that. Anti-communist. That's the most up thing of all time, is that, once again, it feels like it's insane to say, but like Jews have historically been revolutionary people. Like Judaism and communism was the unholy merger for all fascists. That's why Germany had all the smoke for Judeo-Bolshevism, you know? That was the other thing I was going to tell you guys about, which is, have you guys ever heard of the concept of premature anti-fascist? That's the other thing I wanted to talk about today. Premature anti-fascism. Have you guys ever heard of this? It's basically not dissimilar to what Nathan Tankis once famously said that I use all the time, which is being a leftist is about being right but too early. I wonder if there's a YouTube video about it, because I don't want to read the whole article, but there is a Los Angeles Times article, Premature Anti-Fascism and the Power of Self-Identification. Here, Confessions of a Premature Anti-Fascist. Here, from the Wikipedia page. Wait, where'd it go? During the Second Red Scare, which occurred in the United States in the years that immediately followed the end of World War II, the term premature anti-fascist came into currency, and it was used to describe Americans who had strongly agitated or worked against fascism, such as Americans who fought for the Republicans during the Spanish Civil War, before fascism was seen as a proximate and existential threat to the United States, which only occurred generally after the invasion of Poland by Nazi Germany, and only occurred universally after the attack on Pearl Harbor. The implication was that such persons were either communists or communist sympathizers, whose loyalty to the United States was suspect. However, historians John Earl Haynes and Harvey Clare have written that no documentary evidence has been found of the U.S. government referring to American members of the international brigades as premature anti-fascists. The Federal Bureau of Investigation, OSS, and United States Army record use terms such as communist, red, subversive, and radical instead. Indeed, Haynes and Clare indicate that they have found many examples of members of the International Brigade and their supporters referring to themselves sardonically as premature anti-fascists. The reason why the Federal Bureau of Investigation and the OSS in the United States Army were recording who was a communist, red, or subversive, or a radical, all under the umbrella of premature anti-fascism, is because those who resisted against fascism before it was universally adopted as an existential threat to the United States of America was basically prosecuted in the McCarthy trials as not having sufficient loyalty and sympathies to the United States of America and were potential enemies of the state and allies of the USSR. So if you think that this kind of is new, here it is. All right? History constantly repeats itself. It's not new. That's also part of the reason why I know that my cause is just and I will not back away from saying the truth. I first heard the remarkable phrase premature anti-fascist in 1946 when fresh out of the U.S. Army. I went up to New Haven, Connecticut for an interview with the chairman of the Yale Classics Department, to which, taking advantage of the generous provisions of what was popularly known as the GI Bill, I applied for admission to the graduate program for PhD in classics. I had submitted a copy of my certificate of the bachelor's degree I had received from St. John's College, Cambridge in 1936. I did not make any mention of the fact that I had made a rather mediocre showing in the final part of the tripos, ending up with a second class. At least I comforted myself he did better than Auden, who got a third. To jazz up my application a bit, I included my record of the U.S. Army, private captain 1942 to 45. The professor who had served in the U.S. Army in 1718 was very interested and remarked on the fact that in addition to the usual battle stars for service in the European theater, I've been awarded the Croix de Guerre l'Ordre de l'Armée, the highest category for that decoration. I asked how I got it. In July 44, I had parachuted in uniform behind Allied lines in Brittany to arm and organize French resistance forces and hold them ready for action the moment most useful for Allied advance. I butchered it. Shut up. Why were you selected for that operation? He asked. And I told him that I was one of the few people in the U.S. Army who could speak fluent, idiomatic, and if necessary, pungently coarse French. When he asked me where I'd learned it, I told him that I had fought in 1936 on the northwest sector of the Madrid front in the French battalion of the International Brigade. Oh, he said, you were a premature anti-fascist. I was taken aback by the expression, don't even start with me. He's like, I'm sick to my stomach. How, I wondered, could anyone be a premature anti-fascist? Could there be anything such as premature antidote to poison, a premature antiseptic, premature antitoxin? Okay, we get it, dude. If you were not premature, what sort of anti-fascist were you supposed to be? A punctual anti-fascist? A timely one? In fact, in the 30s, as the European situation moved inexorably towards war, the British and French governments, the French often under pressure from the British, passed up one timely opportunity after another to become anti-fascist. They did nothing when Adolf Hitler took Germany out of the League of Nations and began a massive rearmament program, except that the British government negotiated an Anglo-German naval treaty that gave Hitler the right to build U-boats, and in the early 40s, came close to starving Britain into surrender. No action was taken when Hitler reoccupied the Rhineland, demolishing the buffer against an invasion of France created by the Versailles Treaty. They allowed Hitler and Mussolini to supply Franco with planes, tanks, guns, and troops while enforcing a so-called non-intervention agreement that cut supplies to the government. They remained silent when Mussolini conquered Abyssinia and Hitler annexed Austria. And in 1938, they sold down the river, a ludicrous illusion of peace in our time, the only strong democratic state in Eastern Europe that might have been a deterrent to Hitler's plans for the expansion, the Czechoslovak Republic. You couldn't call Chamberlain, Daladier, and Laval timely anti-fascists. They declared war on Hitler in 1939 as he invaded Poland, a declaration that gave no help to the Poles, who were crushed between the armies of Hitler from one side and Stalin from the other. These guys, bro. So what kind of anti-fascists were they? My French maquisards had a phrase for the Frenchmen who in 1944, as the Allied armies broke out of Normandy pocket and raced across France in pursuit of retreating Wehrmacht, finally tried to join the Resistance. Resistance de la dernière heure was their contentious name for them, last-minute anti-fascists. It is a perfect description of Neville Chamberlain and Lord Halifax. But in 1939, last minute was too late. Too late to save the millions who died in the death camps. Too late to save the soldiers and sailors who died in campaigns in Russia, the Middle East and North Africa, Italy, France and Germany, Pearl Harbor, Midway, Guadalcanal, Peleliu, Okinawa, and many other places Americans had never heard of. Too late to save civilians who, like the inhabitants of Guernica, died under the bombs in Rotterdam, London, Hamburg, Berlin, Dresden, Hiroshima. It would have been better to be premature. I did not, of course, say any of this to the professor. I kept quiet and was admitted and resumed to study the ancient authors whom I'd left untouched for 10 years ever since, a few months after graduating from Cambridge. I left for Spain. What I did not realize, something the professor knew perfectly well, was the premature anti-fascist was an FBI code word for communist. There is the meat of the story. It was the label affixed to the dossiers of those Americans who had fought in the brigades when, after Pearl Harbor, and some of them before, they enlisted in the U.S. Army. It was a signal. It was the signal to assign them to non-combat units or inactive fronts, or to deny them the promotions they deserved. Not only did they deserve it, the Army needed them in responsible positions, for they were the only soldiers in it who had any experience in modern war, who had been bombed and strafed by modern German and Italian aircraft, who had faced German and Italian tanks, who had come under the fire of modern artillery, especially Luftwaffe's 88mm anti-aircraft gun, which the German crews had found murderously effective against ground troops because of its high muzzle velocity. It was the latter, the nightmare of the GIs in North Africa, Italy, and France. What made me and many others like me in England, France, Belgium, Holland, Canada, and the United States into premature anti-fascists. I can only speak on my own case. Okay, I don't care about what made him into a premature anti-fascist, but talks about all quiet on the Western Front, the horrors of World War I and trench warfare, deeper malaise that affected us, Great Depression. Interprofessional optimists among the economic pundits could offer little hope to recovery. The Depression was more dispiriting phenomenon in England than in the United States. The Roosevelt New Deal was no panacea, but at least evidence of official concern, whereas the so-called national government's policy of retrenchment was a defiant manifesto of indifference to widespread distress. That's very important info, man. No, it's not. I'm skipping the part. The purpose of why I'm reading this is to show you that the American government actively locked down people, actively targeted people as having loyalty or an anti-fascist commitment before people actually realized that this fascism was no good. That's the whole point of this story. That's the reason why I'm reading it. Yeah. Meanwhile, the money saved up for my scholarship funds, I've been spending my vacations in Paris, living on cheap hotels on the left bank, deepening the knowledge of the French language I had acquired from a brilliant teacher in my London school, making friends among French students. For in France, as in England, la crise, as they called it, is still crippled the economy. As in England, a fascist movement, les croix de feu, or fiery crosses are the Métis debut. One of his demonstrations provoked riots that resulted in 15 dead and more than 1,000 injured. The threat of a fascist coup united the French communist and socialist parties together with the liberals in the Front Populaire. If you remember, there was a new one of those, which won an overwhelming victory in the elections of 1936. For the first time since the long-lasting depression had begun, a government set out to redress some of the injustices. Long overdue reforms were introduced. 40-hour week, paid vacations, and fascist organizations were banned. For the first time, a Western government had broken out of the pattern of retrenchment and repression. Is fascism inevitable under capitalism? I'm not a theory nerd. Yes. Capitalism has inherent contradictions baked into it in the form of constant class antagonism. The two classes, albeit reductive, can be described as the wage laboring class, the proletariat, and those who own capital, the capital ownership class, the bosses, the owners, which is the bourgeois class. These two classes have direct class interests that are at odds with one another. Workers want to work the least amount of time for the most amount of pay, and bosses and capital owners, bosses who demonstrate the interests of your capital owners, want you to work the most amount of time for the least amount of pay. And there is no way to resolve this constant class battle. There are ways to alleviate the pressure. A welfare state will offer some help in the continuation of capitalism, some regulations placed upon the markets. Having said that, however, this does not actually solve the problem. That class antagonism will always exist. And inevitably, the moneyed part of the moneyed class, the bourgeois capital owners, will always win because money is power. And capitalism always leans in the direction of the consolidation of power in the hands of the few against the interests of the many. This is an inherently undemocratic process. The greatest lie ever told, however, is the notion that this structure is actually the most democratic structure. And for a time, this was an evolution from previous formations. Bourgeois revolutions have brought about the liberal democracy, the liberal capitalist democracy that we saw as bringing a bounty of civil liberties alongside it. So yes, capitalism initially was an evolution from previous forms of governance. Having said that, however, capitalism has very clearly outlived its usefulness, but the next stage in our evolution is constantly stopped by that very same consolidated power groups. They tell you that there is no alternative to capitalism. They lie to you all the time. They scare you into submission. They make you think there is no alternative, and the alternative would be far more devastating. There are attempts made towards evolving away from this consolidation of power, and yet those attempts are always thwarted. Under the Cold War, the American government and Western governments actively intervened in these initiatives that the rest of the world was engaging in, partially because that very same class dynamic is also born out of, or also exists in a larger scale between the global South that is hyper exploited and the moneyed interests in the Western world, the developed Western world. In order to ensure that they continue, like Western nations continue to exploit the natural resources and the labor forces of the global South, we must continue at a time when profit rates continue to decline, because that is an inevitability under capitalism, given that automation and technological improvements make it so that profit margins always end up getting smaller and smaller. We must find new profit sectors. And the best possible way to create profit is to tamper with the only malleable aspect of profit, which is labor. Labor is the only movable part of the profit structure. And how do you make sure that labor costs stay relatively low? Well, in developed countries, labor costs obviously increase. People demand more when they have more. People recognize their own material conditions. The best possible, most effective way of ensuring labor costs are kept low is by seeking out new labor markets that are constantly exploited and constantly depressed under the militant nature of imperialism. Imperialism, therefore, is seen as the final stage of capitalism. Without imperialism, capitalism could not continue. Without the welfare state, capitalism could not continue in the short term. And without imperialism, capitalism could not continue. This is why we say social democracies are simply an evolution in the direction of the final evolution of the global economy towards socialism, because social democracies still rely on that unequal exchange. How are they exploited? How is the global South exploited? I don't know. Think about it a little bit. Why is it that no global South nation is ever allowed to have autonomy? How do you think this is as cheap as it actually is? What do you think are the necessary materials for this to exist in the way that it does? The battery, for example. Slave labor makes this as cheap as it possibly is. It's so an ever-present part of our current mode of production of commodities. It is so important. Slave labor is so important to it that the United States Supreme Court literally defended Nestle and other companies to continue the practice of slavery as long as they relegated that responsibility over to third parties that were simply unaccountable. So, create a shell corporation or a third party that actually ends up hiring the slave labor, and you can get off scot-free. And the slaves can't even come back and sue you. That is legal. We made that legal. Anyway, how did I get here? Holy shit. What was I talking about? Things can be historically obsolete. That doesn't mean that they're politically obsolete. Oh, yeah, you're right, actually. That Supreme Court case wasn't even about slavery. It was specifically about child slavery. Oh, someone asked about how capitalism leads to fascism. Yes, when all of that inevitable violence, when all of that inevitable violence in the hands of in the current order of business, when consolidated power, this endless parasitic force of capital ends up demanding more and more from the domestic labor force, ends up demanding more and more from your neighbors, stealing from you both your surplus labor value in the form of profits, and also refusing to give anything back to you in return. And the fatter they get, the more greedy they get, the more resentful the working class becomes, the more angry and volatile the working class becomes due to the inequalities that they experience. Because at the end of the day, wealth is a relative concept. Richness is a relative concept. You're only as rich as those around you are poor. So you start growing resentful. And in that anger, there's either two ways out of this. When contradictions under capitalism worsen, we see that in the form of economic inequality and volatility. When those conditions worsen, when those contradictions become glaringly obvious, you have two options: socialism or barbarism. Either you organize and demand more through organized power, through the labor force, through the only area of impact that you have, the only area of power that you have, because obviously without workers, there would be no profits. Without workers, there would be no production, because your bosses cannot actually manage the factory and work on the factory floor. When people grow resentful, they either organize or they get angry and more reactionary and more fascist, or even if they organize in the direction of demanding more from the profits that they generate, the bosses will eventually realize that the greatest way to deal with this is to restore some semblance of order, to maintain the existing capitalist economic order. This has happened time and time again in fascist nation states, with many of the charismatic leadership of fascist nation states initially starting off as socialists themselves or members of the working class with the interests of the working class, and then quickly sidestepping away instead of offering any sort of material improvement to the existing workforce. They sidestep away to some idealistic notion of a pure race or pure ethnicity that must be defended. This is how fascism comes in, with the help of capital, with the help of your bosses. Your bosses see fascism as a last-ditch effort to restore and maintain the capitalist order. Anyway, and that's how fascism manifests. That is also the final stage of right-wing politics. It's its most pure form. The most pure form of right-wing politics and reactionary politics is fascism. Okay? Unshackled, unburdened by liberal values. It's the most honest form of right-wing sentiment. Because think about it right now. Even those who do not consider themselves to be ideological fascists, like those in the modern Republican Party who simply say they're conservative, they want to conserve, what do? They vilify vulnerable underclass members in an effort to justify their oppression, in an effort to make them out to be the real villains of society, when you, if you spend enough time here, know who the real villains are, know who the real movers and shakers are. That's why I always say a trans person is not your boss, a Guatemalan migrant is not your landlord. It was a moment of jubilation and hope going back to France, but it did not last long. French capital reacted by pulling out of the country, and meanwhile, the newly elected Spanish government of the Front Populaire was challenged by a military revolt. Popular demand in France, huge demonstrations shouting, "Des canons pour l'Espagne! Des avions pour l'Espagne!" The national interest both spoke strongly for the Spanish government's request to purchase arms, but the French premier, Léon Blum, under pressure from London, agreed to join the non-intervention agreement through Germany, and Italy were openly supplying the rebels. In September, I received a letter from my friend John Cornford, the leader of the communist movement in Cambridge, who had just returned from Spain, where he had fought for a few weeks in the Aragon Front, a column organized by Partido Obrero de Unificación Marxista, the POUM party that was later to be suppressed as too revolutionary. He had returned to England to recruit a small British unit that would set an example of training and discipline and shaving to anarchistic militias. Even then, the British had to teach the anarchists how to groom themselves, dude. He asked me to join, and I did so without a second thought. I knew no more about Spanish politics and history than most of my fellow countrymen. That is to say, not much. I had read in translation, but not much, all of Don Quixote and reproductions of the great paintings of Velázquez and Goya. I knew that Philip II had married English reigning queen, blah, 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 blah. Who cares? That guerrilla, which was to become my military specialty in World War II, was a Spanish word. But I had no real understanding of the complicated situation that had produced the military revolt of July 1936. What I did know was that Franco had the full support of Hitler and Mussolini. In fact, that support had been decisive at the beginning of the war. The military coup had failed in Madrid and Barcelona, Spain's principal cities. Franco's best troops, the Foreign Legion and the Regulares, the Moorish mercenaries recruited to fight against their own people, were cooped up in Morocco, since the Spanish Navy had declared for the Republic. Planes of pilots from the Luftwaffe and the Italian Air Force in the first military airlift in history had flown some 8,000 troops across the Sevilla, Franco's base, for the advance on Madrid. And this was all I needed to make up my mind. I left a few days later for Paris with a group of a dozen or so volunteers that John had assembled. There were 3 Cambridge graduates. By the way, you know how recent this history is? We think about this like it happened, multiple lifetimes ago, but there are still alive. You know what I mean? Maybe not many, but it is kind of crazy that like this is one lifetime ago, okay? In the grand scheme of history, what this man is describing is so recent, and yet we always take for granted the current existing peace in Europe as though it was always the norm, okay? Think about that. It hasn't even been 100 years yet. So understand that. We look at the current confines of the European capitals, or the current confines of the European continent, sorry, and we think to ourselves, oh, they were always peaceful. What the f***? These guys have never fought. There has been very short periods where there wasn't endless fighting in Europe, okay? Which is why I always say that people that endlessly fight one another can make up. Just something to remember when you're thinking about like, oh, well, Israel, Palestine, this is just never going to end. It's a conflict that never ends. It's very stupid. Anyway, there were 3 Cambridge graduates and 1 from Oxford, a statistic I've always been proud of, as well as 1 from London University. There was a German refugee artist who has been living in London, 2 veterans of the British Army and 1 in the Navy, an actor, a proletarian novelist, 2 unemployed workmen. Once in Paris, we went to Comité entre deux, a peuple espagnol, and was where John's scheme for a small British unit was the Aragon was abandoned. We were sent for a hotel in Belleville, a working class section of Paris, where we found ourselves at tiny English drop in the sea of large national groups, French, Polish, Belgian, German, Italian, all of them bound for Spain. Painful listen as always, Hasan. Okay, dude. We left next morning for Marseille, where at night we boarded a Spanish vessel that left at midnight. Bridges, Poland. Okay, bro, this guy's just talking about how he fought Franco. Like, sick, dude. We get it. You were a premature anti-fascist. Get to the goddamn point. This man, oh my God. Oh, yeah, Homer's Iliad. Sometime later. Oh, my Lord. Of course, he's a classics PhD, chat. Of course. What a goddamn yapper this guy is. Back home, I watched other despondencies. The British government persisted in its policy of appeasement, and the prospect of victory in Spain receded fast as Hitler and Mussolini gave Franco steadily increasing preponderance in weapons and troops. A meeting with a young American whom I had met at Cambridge some years before, but with whom I now fell in love with, changed my life. Not at least because when after Munich, she yielded to her parents' anxious insistence that she come home. She persuaded me to apply for an immigration visa. In the interim, I had ceased to think of myself as a communist. The Nazi-Soviet pact of 1939 was understandable. The Western betrayal of Czechoslovakia was a clear signal to Stalin that if Hitler turned against Russia, as he repeatedly announced he would in his book Mein Kampf, the West would not raise a finger to help. By the way, this guy, who lived through it, has a better understanding of Ribbentrop? I forget. God damn it. Ribbentrop. Not Ribbentrop. I'm sorry. I'm stupid. Okay. I don't know anything about history. Ribbentrop was a self-defense pact for the USSR in a time of unprecedented appeasement from European allies, even though the USSR was always the enemy of Nazi Germany. The USSR also routinely asked for pacts from their European counterparts, and every single one of them was like, "Nah, it's fine. Let him do his thing. You know, let Hitler do his thing. He's fine. He's just like, in the words of Candace Owens, he's just making Germany great. he's just making Germany great. Oh, he invaded Poland. Okay, never mind. Maybe he wasn't making Germany great. Maybe he was doing the gay globalist thing, which is, again, what Candace Owens said before being hired by the Daily Wire. Okay. The West would not raise a finger to help. The brutal annexation of the Baltic states and still more the aggressive war against Finland were harder to accept. I was appalled, too, by the show trials of the old Bolsheviks, Bukharin, and the rest. I read the verbatim accounts of their so-called confessions published by Moscow in English and available at left-wing bookshops in London. I was appalled. Yeah, it's really up. Really up what the USSR did. Anyway, I'm not going to say anything else. Okay. These tales of recruitment by the British Secret Service in the first days of the revolution in my lifetime of espionage and sabotage were beyond belief. They can only be the product of fear and perhaps the experience of torture. I was sickened too by the reports later confirmed that our General Kleber, whose coolness under fire at University City had taught us all how to face danger, had been recalled to Russia and executed. Loyalty to the ideals for which my friends had died in Spain was undermined by the grim realities that I could no longer ignore. Oh my God, this guy's got the George Orwell brain rot, who also fought against Franco in Spain. I feel like anarchism is a poison. Okay, I'm gonna say it. Anarchism is a brain poison, and it causes anarchists to do the right thing ahead of time. Okay, and then only to drop doing the right thing and become agents of the state. You, I mean, come on, dude. It's just like, why does it happen so frequently? Okay. I literally thought this was Orwell Lamau came in late. No, this is an American guy. You love the state? I do. What do you mean? Of course I love the state, dude. There is no other way for a state to inevitably perish. There's no other way for a state to inevitably perish unless the state itself moves in the direction, moves the industrial capacity in the direction of communism ultimately. If you ever want a true anarchist utopia, well, I don't think anybody wants that, but when I came to the United States, I joined no party, and though remaining a resolute defender of the cause of freedom in Spain, I refrained from political activity. When the war finally broke out in 1939, it was aptly named the Phony War. Nothing happened in the West, and as Poland went under. When something did happen, and Hitler drove the British army out of France, I was tempted to return, but I realized I owed more to my wife, who had worked like a Trojan to get me admitted to the United States. Then I did the government that had made this defeat inevitable. I also had a feeling that America would sooner or later become involved, and I would be able to fight in the uniform of the country I was beginning to love. Oh, he got American brain rot. Anarchists and trots are always like that, just liberals. Okay, trots are not liberals. Anarchists are liberals. Trots are conservative when pushed to... Anyway, all right, let's continue. When that happened, I somehow escaped the discrimination that hampered the military careers of so many American veterans of the brigades. It only looks like a bullet wound. Doctor noticed a scar on my throat. I told him I was asked how I got it, and don't tell me he had it. It was a hunting accident or cleaning a gun. No repercussions from this incident, and was later selected for OCS and commissioned. And eventually, I fought in Europe in a specialized force organized by the American OSS. This guy literally became an agent, by the way. The British SOE and the Free French to coordinate the action of the French resistance forces with the advance of the Allied armies. It was the OSS 2 that later sent me to North Italy to work with large partisan formations that were operating on our side in the lines, but in mountainous areas where heavy American equipment could not be used. The OSS also gave Americans who had fought in the brigades. This is one of the worst aspects of the OSS, is that they literally eventually turned on the very same partisans that were communist and socialist and worked to eliminate them from power in the aftermath of World War II. In an effort to, restore the American version of fascism, burger fascism, okay, by way of NATO, a protection racket against the real scary nature of Soviet-style communism. Scary, okay. They did NATO. I was in Italy, sudden reminder of Spain. Okay, this actually was just his recounting of why he fought fascism. I didn't realize that the rest of the story was eventually going to devolve into that. I thought there was a point where he was going to talk about the Red Scare. Nope, I was wrong.